Angus trim designs at a third of his prices. Sounds like a bit of a dream come true, doesn't it? Well, let's take a look and see if it is that dream, or perhaps more of a nightmare. Hello, this is Kyle, also known as Études, and today I'm going to be reviewing this Kingston Arms 13th century arming sword. Right up front, you should know this sword doesn't belong to me. It's on loan from Vic over at Unsheathed Sword Reviews. Take a look at their channel, link in the description. I highly recommend their reviews. So this sword retails at around $350 to $390, depending on which store you look at. That puts it at the very top end of the budget range, and personally I would consider it at a low end of the mid-range swords. That's where I'm going to be comparing the sword to. Now, as I said, Angus Trim has designed this sword and a couple other ones that Kingston Arms makes. He provides all the specifications for the swords, and then Kingston Arm manufactures them, I believe, in China. They are distributed by Cas Iberia, the same company that distributes Hanwei, and I believe they are pretty much the parent company of Kingston Arms. So this sword is the second one in my series about Type 14 swords. The first being the Solingen that I posted 2 weeks ago, and the next will be the Windlass Type 14, coming up in 2 weeks. Now this is a kind of an interesting sword for a Type 14. The blade is not quite as broad at the base as on many Type 14s, but it has a nice gentle taper to it all the way out to the acute point. The biggest difference from a Type 14, I would say, is in the cross section. Mr. Oakeshott did say that Type 14 swords were usually lenticular, although some did have a soft central ridge. This one does have a central ridge, but it's a little firmer than what I would consider soft. So Type 14 swords are good balanced swords at cutting and thrusting, and this one is no exception. It would have seen use during the 13th to 14th centuries, often paired with a buckler or shield. Now, it does come with a scabbard, and this is a pretty bare-bones scabbard. You know, it has almost no decoration. It's got this thicker leather up near the top and a chape here at the bottom, which is interestingly riveted to the scabbard. I don't know that I've seen that very often. I don't know how authentic that is. But the fit, there's a decent amount of rattle here, and some retention some of the time. You know, it came out easily there, and then it didn't come out easily, so kind of inconsistent retention. So it's pretty good there. So yeah, inconsistent retention, I'd say. Overall though, for the price that you get, it's nice to have a wood core scabbard to store the sword in, and this fits the bill. It does the job it's intended to do. So let's take a look at the sword, starting with the hilt. Both the pommel and the crossguard, and the chape on the scabbard for that matter, have this kind of tumbled finish to them, which is pretty attractive in my opinion. I believe these fittings are stainless steel, but don't quote me on that. The pommel is kind of a blend between a Type H and Type I, and it's, a pretty generic wheel pommel, which looks very similar to most of the ones that Mr. Angus Trim uses on his swords. It is peen to the tang, and the peen is frankly pretty sloppy. Not only has it not really been shaped all that well, there's a lot of errant hammer marks around there. But that's not really a big deal. That's purely aesthetics. It doesn't affect the functionality of the sword at all. And frankly, on a sword that is less expensive, you don't need to spend a ton of time cleaning up the peen. As long as it's solid, that's what's important, right? All of the edges on this pommel have been chamfered nicely, so there's no hot spots. When you hold it and rest the pommel against your palm, it feels really good. It kind of locks in there in place nicely. It's a little on the dainty side, I have to say, as is the crossguard. That's kind of typical for Angus Trim swords. His pommels generally aren't that big. And it's not that that's a bad thing. One of the primary points of a pommel is to balance the sword properly, get the harmonics right. And if you have that right, you don't need a big pommel. It's just something to notice. I would like to see a little bit more dimension to it. It's just a flat pommel with just this very slightly raised boss in the center. And it would be nice if there was a little bit of tapering in here somewhere. But again, Lower cost sword, not as important. The grip is pretty bare bones here. It's a wood core, leather wrap, cord texture on it. There's no risers at all. And I would personally like to see like maybe a riser up here at the crossguard and one down here by the pommel, but it's not a big deal. It fits in the hand very well. It's very comfortable and it's very easy to index the blade. So the grip functionally is perfect. I really enjoy how this sword handles when just feeling the grip in the hand. The seam on the grip kind of wanders around a little bit, but it's not really much of an eyesore. It blends in with the color pretty well. Over on Unsheathed Sword Reviews, Vic said that he doesn't feel the seam at all.
This has a nice red grip. While it looks really, really good, there is a very noticeable seam, and the seam is not straight. It kind of does the zigzag thing. Now, you can't feel the seam. It doesn't affect handling at all, but these are just kind of aesthetic imperfections that in a sub $500 sword, you're gonna notice versus a $1,200 sword, you would expect to be a lot better.
I have to disagree with Vic a little bit there. I can feel the seam when I'm holding it, but it's not in a bad way. It's not uncomfortable at all, and actually feeling that seam can help with edge alignment. The crossguard is kind of like a Oakshot Type 7 with the central ridge and spike of a Type 11. It does start a little thicker here at the center and taper out towards the ends of the quill ends. And there's a little bit of rounding here, so it's not just a straight rectangular shape. There's a little bit of dimension to it, which is a nice touch. The gap in the guard, well, actually, the best way to explain it is Vic's explanation, so take it away, Vic.
It has a very large gap in the crossguard and an asymmetrical gap. Now, that doesn't really affect its performance, as we'll talk about later in the video. There might be a little bit of a concern with water getting in there, if you're cutting water bottles and stuff like that. I'm kind of a stickler for fit and finish, and it doesn't bother me all that much, but it is very apparent once you start playing with it, holding your hand and looking at it.
And now we come to, without a doubt, the biggest problem with this sword. The blade does not sit in the crossguard properly. There's actually a gap where you can see the shoulders of the blade on both sides of the guard. I can just about get a fingernail in there. I'll have some close-ups of it to show you a little bit better. This is not good. This is, frankly, a big problem with this sword. This means that the fit of the blade to the crossguard and the hilt is not correct. This sword the shoulders of the sword should sit into the crossguard. There should be a little recess in here, and there is one in here, but the shoulders should sit in there, locking it in place. Here, you can see the recess, but the shoulders aren't seated all the way in. What that means is that the crossguard's going to come loose. In fact, it already has. And now it's time to talk about the business end, the blade. As always, here's my measurements. So the sword starts at about 5.5 millimeters thick at the crossguard, gently tapering down to a little bit below 5 millimeters right before the end of the fuller, and then because the cross section is a diamond past the fuller, it actually gets a bit thicker all the way back up to about 5 millimeters. And then from there, it tapers very rapidly down to about 2.5 millimeters right before the tip. This leads to a sword that is actually quite stiff. There's not much flex to it at all, as you can see there. And if we take a look at, just some vibration, very little vibration nodes. It's really hard to see where they are. But it is balanced at about 5.25 inches, right around there. And this leads to a sword that is pretty lively. It weighs just over 2 pounds from what I remember, and it feels good in the hand. The fuller runs about 2/3 of the way up the blade, and they are pretty straight, and they end very close to the same spot on both sides. The finish on the sword is a nice satin, and there are quite a few ripples on it. Just looking down the blade, I can see a lot of ripples, which, not particularly important on a sword that is designed to be good value for the money, because cleaning up those requires a lot more attention to detail, and more time equals more money, right? The tip is a nicely acute point while still having a little bit of thickness to it, so it's not a pure thruster. You know, it's not a reinforced point, it's not a needle tip like you'll see on some of the later medieval swords, but it should be pretty effective at thrusting. So one kind of interesting thing about this sword is that when Vic over at Unsheathed Sword Reviews got it, it did not have this secondary bevel that you can see on it. Kingston Arms generally has superb edge geometry with one smooth bevel from the center all the way to the edge, but their final sharpening, frankly, is lackluster at best. I've owned several Kingston Arms swords before, and every single one of them has just been marginally sharp, is what I would call it. Their edge geometry, like I said, is beautiful. They just don't seem to put that final bit of sharpening on it. So Vic actually had a professional sharpener put a much sharper edge on it, and that's what led to this secondary bevel. And that's blended pretty decently. It feels a little bit closer to Appleseed. It's not fully, because I can actually feel where the geometry changes, but it's not bad. To test the edge, let's try some paper cutting. Now, real quick, this is not what swords are intended for. You know, they weren't intended to cut paper, but it still can be instructive to see just how sharp the sword is. So what I'm going to do is just thrust it in here, and then I'm just going to let the sword's weight do the cut. I'm not putting any pressure on that at all. All I was doing is gently sliding it. And it's just one very smooth, even cut. This is a very sharp sword. Let's try the other edge. Yep, this edge actually is probably a little bit sharper than the other one. Very smooth, very good cuts. Now let's take a look at some cutting footage. I just got done cutting with this Kingston Arms Type 14, and I figured let's talk about handling. First off, it cuts very well, and it's a lot of fun to swing and move around because it's generally a pretty light sword. It's considerably lighter than that windlass that I am reviewing soon, and it's balanced, you know, at about looks like around 5 inches. I'll have the actual stats on in the review, but it feels really good to move. It's very light. You can throw the tip out there easily. You can stop the cut without feeling any pain or discomfort in the arm. Redirects motion very well like that, or continues the motion very well like that. If I start a cut and go to another direction, feels good doing that. It's if I remember right, it's a pretty stiff blade. Yeah, there's not a whole lot of flex to it, which does aid in the cutting and definitely the thrusting. This is actually, aside from cutting, this is an excellent thruster too, which is a lot of fun to use. You know, I was able to get several thrusts into that 2-liter soda bottle, and more than I'm usually able to, because frankly, my accuracy when thrusting is usually pretty terrible. And this one, it's pretty easy to thrust with it and easy to guide it to where you want it to go. So the point control is actually quite good. The grip is very comfortable. There's absolutely no hot spots anywhere. I found myself oftentimes actually pulling my hand back a little bit to rest the pommel in my palm rather than, you know, up where I would normally put my hand. And I think I was doing that. It gives you just a little bit more authority in the cut. And the way this pommel is shaped, it's so perfectly smoothed out that it just feels natural to put it into the palm of the hand rather than behind the hand. So one thing I pointed out earlier in the review is that the shoulders of the blade are not seated into the crossguard correctly. Well, unfortunately, it's gotten a little worse because I don't know if you can see or hear that. Let me put it next to the microphone. But it is definitely loose now. Before I did any cutting, if I wiggled this vigorously, I could just barely feel any looseness to it. Now it's noticeable, and that's not good. You know, that's a durability issue, and it really should not have passed quality control because it's very obvious that the shoulder does not rest into the guard, and it's a big problem. It should not be like this. And you know, I want to give thanks to Victor of Unsheathed Sword Reviews for giving me the go-ahead to cut with it, because I did point out this problem at the crossguard before doing any cutting, and I asked, do you still want to have me cut with it? Do you want, because you know, that could loosen the guard exactly as it did. And he said, yes, go ahead and cut with it. He wants my full and honest opinion. So kudos to you, Victor, and thank you for allowing me to review your sword. It's greatly appreciated. So one thing I want to drive home on the handling, this sword thrusts incredibly well. I'm not accurate when I thrust. It's something I'm trying to work on, but it's not easy when you haven't tried it very much. And this sword makes it easy. I can direct it to where I want it to go very easily without pretty much any difficulty at all. And this is something that I wasn't expecting from this sword, even though they did mention it over on Unsheathed Sword Reviews. In fact, let's take a look at that.
It swings and cuts about as well as you would expect, but I think the thing that is kind of shocking is how well it thrusts, which is by design, right. But until you start thrusting into something with a little resistance, you're surprised by how far you'll make it in, even with incredibly poor form like we have, so.
Yeah, it almost feels like you miss, which is funny. Yeah, totally.
It really does. So. Yeah. It's like, oh, there's nothing there except for the thing I just stabbed.
Exactly.
So.
Yeah, except for that thing.
So like I said, even though they mentioned that, I still wasn't expecting this sword to be just as good at thrusting as it is. It really surprised me. And now it's time to talk bottom line. This sword sells between $350 and $400. Is it worth that price? Well, unfortunately, I can't say it is. And that's pretty much exclusively because of this crossguard. The fact that the blade does not sit all the way into the guard is, in my opinion, a fatal flaw with this sword. This is unacceptable at any price point. I wouldn't accept this on a $100 sword, let alone a almost $400 sword. And unfortunately, this seems like a recurring problem. I've seen Matthew Jensen do a couple reviews of Kingston arm swords, both one of this model and their Angus Trim designed Type 18 sword, and both of his, the crossguard came loose as well. That's a recurring problem, and that's bad quality control, and therefore, I can't say that I think the sword would be worth it if that was fixed, because I don't know if it's fixed. You know, if you buy a new one, I think it's entirely possible your crossguard would be loose as well, or would come loose. And like I said, I find that to be an unacceptable flaw in this price, and any price point. And you know, this is just so very disappointing because I want to like this sword. I want to love this sword. Everything about it is just great, except for the crossguard. Now again, the sharpness, I know is not accurate to what I would get, and I would, if I got one of these, I would need to get it sharpened as well. But the handling, the feel, just, it's such a fun sword to use, and it's just, it kills me that it has this flaw. I really hope Kingston Arms will take a look at their production and see what's causing this and fix it, because they are just so close to a really superb sword that would punch well above its price range. But now, they're just not there yet. And that's going to wrap up this review. Once again, thank you, Vic, for sending me this sword to review. And to all my other viewers, if you haven't checked them out, I highly recommend you do so. One of my swords is going to eventually make its way over to them for a review on their channel as well. But until then, Alien Tude out.